Classes settle down that easily. That would be great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Arthur Urbano. I teach New Testament and early Christian studies in the theology department here at PC, and I'm also chair of our committee on Catholic Jewish Theological Exchange, which is the committee that organizes and plans these events. So on behalf of that committee and the theology department, I'd like to welcome all of you here this afternoon for our fall 2011 program, which is part of the lecture and colloquium series, Theological Exchange Between Catholics and Jews. I especially would like to welcome you who are faculty, staff, and students of the college, and also extend a warm welcome to those of you joining us from the local community. This series seeks to promote interreligious understanding and dialogue by focusing on themes of mutual religious and theological interest in the Catholic and Jewish traditions. In short, we see this as an opportunity for Catholics and Jews to learn about and from one another. Today's lecture, which is co-sponsored by the Theology Department and the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies, would not be possible with the generous gifts of our donors. And in particular, I would like to thank the Diocese of Providence, the Edward and Barbara Feldstein Family Fund, and the alumni and friends of the college, both Jewish and Catholic, who lend their financial and spiritual support to this series. We're very grateful and thankful to all of you for making this forum possible. Today marks the anniversary of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, when in 1938, violent riots broke out against Jews living in Germany and Austria. Synagogues, Jewish shops, and cemeteries were destroyed, and tens of thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. These tragic events remind us of the evil of ideologies of hatred and the consequences of ignorance and indifference. And they call us to seek paths of understanding, reconciliation, peace, and cooperation. For those of us who are Catholic, the efforts of Blessed John Paul II towards healing the relationship between Jews and Catholics are paradigmatic. And on a recent trip to his native Germany, Pope Benedict XVI reiterated that the dialogue between Jews and Catholics is an irrevocable commitment of the Church. So we see this forum in a way as contributing to this important dialogue. It's a great pleasure for us today to welcome to Providence College Rabbi Wayne Franklin. Rabbi Franklin has been the senior rabbi at Temple Emanu-El in Providence since 1981. He is a 1965 graduate of Yeshiva University and was ordained as a rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in 1970. In addition to his teaching and pastoral ministry, Rabbi Franklin has served as chair of the Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Rhode Island, and for over 20 years has chaired the Rhode Island Interfaith Commemoration of the Holocaust. He is a member of the Mayor's Task Force on Prisoner Reentry and has been a leader in various interfaith endeavors, including the Rabbis and Priest Dialogue and the Abrahamic Accord. Currently, he chairs the Publications Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly, the International Association of Conservative Rabbis. He has been the recipient of numerous awards, including an honorary doctorate of divinity from the Rabbinical Assembly, the Jewish Federation's Never Again Award, and the Interfaith Leadership Award of the National Conference for Community and Justice. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Franklin, whose lecture is entitled, My Children Have Vanquished Me, Decision-Making in Judaism. Rabbi Franklin.
Thank you, Arthur. Appreciate your gracious invitation and introduction. And I also appreciate your recognizing that this is the anniversary of Kristallnacht. An event like this didn't and couldn't have happened 73 years ago in Germany and in most of Europe. And it is certainly a gratifying and welcome experience that Jews and Christians can join together in interfaith study and mutually respectful relationships as we do here in our community and in many places in the world now. The world is definitely a different place, thank God. Judaism has no pope. Many of us who look at Catholicism from the outside are tempted to think that there is a high degree of uniformity within the Catholic Church, since it has a titular head and a recognized hierarchy. I know from my 2 decades of co-chairing the Rabbis and Priests Dialogue group here in Rhode Island that it's not so simple. And I just read that the Church is instituting a new form of the liturgy in English that some like and others have reservations about. So if there's diversity of practice and opinion in a centralized church such as the Catholic Church, imagine how much more diversity there is in Judaism, a religious community without a centralized authority. The starting premise for any discussion of the source of authority in Judaism is this: God is the source of authority in Judaism. In his book, The Halachic Process, my colleague Rabbi Joel Roth calls this the Grundnorm, the ground foundational norm of Jewish tradition. The Torah, 5 books of Moses specifically, are considered to be the will of God. The classic text which outlines the transmission of authority in early Judaism is in the Mishnah, the earliest collection of rabbinic teachings. It's found at the beginning of Tractate Avot, popularly known as Pirkei Avot, the teachings of the fathers of the rabbinic tradition. The passage in Pirkei Avot draws an imaginarily straight line from God, who is the mitzaveh, the commander, the one who commands at Sinai, to the rabbis, who continue to teach God's message on the basis of that transmitted authority right to this very day. The Mishnah says, Moses received Torah from God at Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly. The men of the great assembly are the very earliest of the rabbis as best we know. One imagines from this passage an intact transmission of unchanged teaching from Sinai to the succeeding generations. But it's not that simple. In 2 verses in Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 2, and chapter 13, verse 1, the Torah tells us that we may not add to or subtract anything from this divine given text. In other words, there is no legislative body to amend the rules as the Torah is handed from one generation to the next. However, my friend Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who's the rector of the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, cites Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 8, and the subsequent verses, which says, if a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen, and appear before the Levitical priests or the magistrate in charge at that time and present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that it is announced to you from that place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. Rabbi Dorff, in his book, The Unfolding Tradition, Jewish Law After Sinai, explains that based on these verses, judges were authorized to interpret and apply Jewish law in every generation. He goes on to say that Jewish leaders interested in making Jewish law relevant and vibrant in every generation have expanded the judicial function, effectively enabling judges to make new laws under the guise of interpreting the Torah, including the Torah's demand that Jews should not veer to the left or right from what the judges in each generation tell them to do. The primary function of a rabbi in ancient times was to serve as a judge. But judging meant that one had to master the sources, the Torah, that is the 5 books of Moses, and other biblical texts, including the prophets and the sacred writings. These comprise the totality of the Hebrew Bible, which is known in Hebrew by the acronym Tanakh. The biblical collection is referred to as the written Torah. The rabbis or judges were expected to carefully examine and interpret the primary texts in light of the questions or new circumstances presented to them. That process is known as midrash, which means inquiry or seeking. Now, there are 2 types of midrash. in the rabbinic tradition: legal midrash, or halakha, which directs Jewish practice, and narrative midrash called agadah, which contains theological, homiletical, and ethical attitudes and ideas. Both halachic or legal and agadic or narrative midrash are collected in the works of the rabbis. And many people have thought that these were independent realms of teaching. But my teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory, makes a cogent case for demonstrating that the halakha, or the law, is often shaped by the ideas and attitudes expressed in the agadah, the theology. That was true in the formative period of Jewish tradition, and it remains true in modern times as we continue to expand the application of ancient teachings to modern life. Who were these rabbis, and when did they live? The earliest rabbis are known as Tanaim. Their teachings are found in the Mishnah. The earliest teachings in the Mishnah are from around the year 200 BCE and continue to around 200 CE when the Mishnah was compiled. You'll understand that Jesus lived in the middle of this period. After the teachings of the Tanaim in the Mishnah, their successors commented on and clarified and expanded their work in the Talmud from about 200 CE to around 500 CE. The Talmudic rabbis are called Amoraim. You will find both halakha, or law, and agadah, or lore, in both the Mishnah and the Talmud. Large compendium of rabbinic teaching in Mishnah, Talmud, and assorted collections of midrash is known as the oral Torah. Now, it was originally transmitted only orally in deference to the written Torah, but it now comprises countless volumes of commentary upon commentary. As each period in Judaism came to a close, the material of that era was set down in writing, though it is still called oral teaching to this day. But I will show you a copy of one of my Talmud volumes. You will see how non-oral it is. This is, let me just step away from here. This is one page of Talmud, which has the Talmudic text, first the Mishnah, then the Talmud following it. But on both sides are commentaries. You have on the inner margin the commentary of Rashi, medieval 11th century, 12th century commentator, and then the work on the outside, the Tosafot, his grandchildren, often disagreeing with Grandpa, and other assorted commentaries around the side, and cross-references to yet later materials, codes of Jewish law, and so forth. And it continues this way, page after page after page. This is a standard kind of classical rabbinic presentation of both Bible and rabbinic teachings. Core in the page is the main teaching, and the commentaries swirl around the outside. Not one voice, but many voices on the page. So, in interpreting in their work of defining or what the Torah means, the rabbis identify some of their ordinances as deoraita, the Aramaic word which means Torah, and the understanding is that these laws are clearly stated in the Torah, specifically in the 5 books of Moses. Other laws which they derive are acknowledged as being what they call d'Rabbanan, rabbinic legislation. D'Rabbanan legislation is deemed less binding than d'Oraita law, since the former is regarded as coming straight from the Holy One, while the rabbinic legislation is of a lesser stature, but only a little bit less. Despite the rabbinic distinctions between d'Oraita, legislated in the Torah, and d'Rabbanan, rabbinically legislated, we have to recognize that, in truth, teachings in both categories are arrived at by the process of exegesis, or what we call midrash. So what makes one law d'Oraita and another law d'Rabbanan? That's not exactly simple or clear either. Rabbi Joel Roth, who's professor of Talmud at the Jewish Theological Seminary, says that we must conclude that the only thing about these two categories that is not subject to dispute is the fact that they exist. To which of the two categories any given norm should be assigned can be a matter of considerable dispute. Let me give you one example of this differentiation between categories or status levels of law. The Torah stipulates in Exodus 22:24 that if you lend money to any of my people that is poor among you, you shall not be to him as a creditor, neither shall you impose interest upon him. The rabbis understood the Torah law, the d'oraita, to mean that it is forbidden to charge or pay fixed interest, meaning that one can neither lend nor borrow on the condition that the borrower repay with more than he originally received. This injunction applies to both the lender and the borrower. There is innovation here, because the sound of the verse might convey a prohibition only on the lenders charging interest, but not the borrowers paying interest. But the rabbis regarded both prohibitions as biblical. As to a rabbinic decree, a d'Rabbanan extension of this ruling, we learned, for example, that in a credit sale, it is possible for a buyer to receive goods worth more than he actually paid for them because of fluctuations in market prices between the time of the purchase and the time of the delivery. This would be considered quasi-interest, and the rabbis prohibited it also. The rabbis also make rulings which they knew were not grounded in Torah dictates. Elliot Dorff tells us that these rulings are called takanot, literally fixes, and they form two functions. There are takanot that fill gaps where the Torah is simply silent about a matter which needs to be addressed. These takanot can be either understood as rabbinic innovations, and when there are new realities which arise and require that the law be changed, the rabbis instituted takanot which fixed the law or repaired it. In studying these laws which prohibit interest, the rabbis realized that people would be unlikely to lend money if they could gain no benefit from the use of their money. They recognized that the laws of the Torah were meant to alleviate poverty, not to exacerbate it. But the rules prohibiting interest were likely to make it harder for people to make a living, because money for business would not be available to lubricate the system. This would worsen the very condition that the Torah was trying to ameliorate. So the rabbis in the time of the Mishnah created an arrangement whereby a person who needed capital to operate a business could enter a partnership with a person who had capital to invest. As partners, they would share the profits of the business, and both would benefit. The working partner would have a livelihood, and the silent partner would benefit from income earned by his investment. This is just one of many important takanot, or legal fixes, that the rabbis instituted. Let's return to the original text in Pirkei Avot, the teachings of the rabbinic fathers, where we learned about the transmission of Torah through the ages. In this passage, and of course in the Bible, we have a sense that the events at Sinai and the revelations to the prophets had some supernatural qualities or components to them. The late Professor Ephraim Urbach of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem acknowledges this in his book, The Sages. He points out that the most characteristic feature of the prophet is that he claimed for himself direct authority in the name of the Lord, who speaks with him. Urbach contends, however, that the power of prophetic teachings is in the fact that the prophets themselves were also sages, not because of any supernatural connections that they had. Urbach also points out that when there were manifestations of miracle working among the sages, those manifestations were discounted and not considered relevant to proper teaching and decision making. And that is precisely the kind of story that produces the quotation supposedly from the Holy One himself, which informs the title of my presentation. It is a long, multifaceted story in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Bava Metzia, which means literally the middle gate, and it deals with a variety of civil laws. But this story is in Agadah, a narrative which is much more a theology lesson than a lesson in Jewish law. And yet, the theology has a crucial impact on decision-making. The story is popularly known as the Tanur Shel Achnai, the story of the snake-shaped oven. Let me tell you the story. The subject of the dispute centers on whether a particular type of clay oven called an Achnai oven can contract ritual impurity. An achnai oven is one which is rounded like a coiled snake, which in Aramaic, derived from the Greek, I think, is called an achna. The details of the case are really much too esoteric and irrelevant for our discussion now. Suffice it to say that there was a dispute among rabbis, the majority of the sages versus their colleague Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, one of the preeminent scholars of the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. The majority of the rabbis declared that this achnai-shaped oven was susceptible to ritual impurity. Rabbi Eliezer insisted that it was not susceptible. According to the Talmudic legend, Rabbi Eliezer marshaled all the arguments in the world, but his colleagues didn't accept them. He then said to them, if the halacha, the law, is in accordance with me, let this carob tree prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place and moved 100 cubits, or some say 400 cubits. His colleagues said to him, one doesn't bring proof from a carob tree. He said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with me, let the channel of water prove it. The channel of water turned and flowed backward. And they said to him, one doesn't bring proof from a channel of water. He then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with me, let the walls of this house of study prove it. The walls of the house of study leaned to fall. But another colleague, Rabbi Yehoshua, rebuked them and said, if Talmudic sages argue with one another about the halakha, what affair is it of yours? So the walls didn't fall out of respect for Rabbi Yehoshua, but they didn't straighten up out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer, and they remained leaning. Then Rabbi Eliezer said to his colleagues, if the halakha is in accordance with me, let it be proved from heaven. A heavenly voice went forth and said, why are you disputing with Rabbi Eliezer? For the halakha is in accordance with him in everything. Rabbi Yehoshua then rose to his feet and said, it is not in heaven. Let me interrupt the story for just a moment and explain. In declaring it is not in heaven, Rabbi Yehoshua was quoting Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14, which says, surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you today is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heaven and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who among us can go across to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it? No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to observe it. In context, this passage encourages adherents of the Torah not to be overwhelmed or put off, thinking that following the Torah is too difficult for them. When the Torah says it is not in heaven, it means it's not remote, it's not too lofty, it's not impossible for you to follow. But when Rabbi Yehoshua uses the words, it is not in heaven, he's taking them out of context. He is making a midrash on the text, which he construes for his argument, which we'll see now as the story continues. The Talmud then asks, what does it is not in heaven mean? Rabbi Yirmiyah said, the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, and we do not pay attention to a heavenly voice. For you, Lord, already wrote in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority to incline, quoting Exodus 23, verse 2. This implies that disputes must be solved by majority vote of the rabbis. But this too, of course, is a midrash created by taking these words out of their context. The story now continues and becomes even more of a fantasy. Rabbi Nathan met Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time? He said to him, he smiled and said, my children have vanquished me. My children have vanquished me. Now, it's very possible that the argument about the achnai oven's susceptibility to ritual impurity between Rabbi Eliezer and his colleagues is really a question of how conservative or how progressive the rabbis should be in their interpretations. Eliezer was known to be very strict and unyielding. His colleagues may have felt that the tradition needed greater flexibility to adapt to new emerging situations, and that was only possible through creative interpretation, literally through the process of midrash. The lesson that emerges very clearly from this tale is that once the Torah is handed to people, what they decide by majority rule is what the Torah comes to mean. The rabbis, who have mastered biblical and rabbinic teaching, are entrusted with the authority to interpret Torah and to teach it to others. But we will see that even this is not so simple. Who are legitimate decision makers in Judaism? Classically, they were the rabbis who received smicha, the laying on of hands by their teachers who entrusted the tradition to them, based on their mastery of the texts of both the written and the oral Torahs. They also had to possess sufficient wisdom to make intelligent rulings and judgments. One scholar or group of scholars ordained their students, producing the next generation, and so on. And this is how the system continued for centuries and centuries. The rabbis of the Talmud were followed by the genius sages of Babylonia, who were known as Gaonim. They were followed by people known as the Rishonim, the early masters in medieval times, and they in turn were followed by the Acharonim, the later masters, who comprised more recent scholars, continuing the line of authority right to our very day. Jewish law continued to unfold through the march of the centuries, and as it did so, it was influenced by the cultures in which our ancestors found themselves. As Jews experienced different cultural influences or different religious traditions, those influences affected the evolution of Judaism in ways that made it appear different from one community or one region to another. For example, in about the year 1000 of the Common Era, Rabbi Gershom of Rutenberg in Germany issued a takana, as I said before, a legal fix or an innovation, which forbid Jews living in Germany and France, that region known as Ashkenaz, from practicing polygamy. Until then, polygamy had been based on biblical models and was quite common. Rabbi Gershom's ruling was to be in effect for 500 years, and it applied only to Ashkenazi Jews, Jews in Europe, Northern Europe, not Sephardi Jews who lived in Spain and Portugal and North Africa. From this we learned two things. First, there were and still are two primary differing legitimate traditions of practice among Jews. And second, we see how Jews responded to the influences that they experienced in the surrounding cultures in the midst of which they lived. Ashkenazi Jews lived among Christians who practiced monogamy. It appears that Rabbi Gershom felt it unseemly that Jews should not behave similarly. After all, Adam and Eve provided the earliest model of marriage. Jews living among Muslims felt no such compunction, and their practice of polygamy did not change. Examples of such changes abound, but it's important to recognize that these innovations were always considered by the rabbis who instituted them to be authentic interpretations of what God had commanded at Sinai. Disagreements were abundant, even as the leading rabbis of each generation sought to achieve some semblance of conformity and common practice in the halakha, in Jewish law. One attempt at standardization was made by the famous Spanish Sephardi scholar, rabbi, philosopher, and physician Moses Maimonides, whose name you may well have heard. He lived in the 12th century. Among Maimonides' many noble and enduring legacies is his 14-volume Code of Jewish Law, in which he attempts to give Jews a complete guide to Jewish practice. But his conclusions were not accepted by everyone, despite his great stature. Later in the 16th century, another Sephardi rabbi, Joseph Caro, writing in Safed in northern Israel, again tried to standardize Jewish practice. As soon as his work was published, Rabbi Moses Isserles in Poland added alternative practices to reflect the customs of the Ashkenazi Jews. And so this major work of Jewish law, which is known as the Shulchan Aruch, literally means the set table, contains on the same page, in that center block that I showed you, two parallel traditions side by side. It remains an important source of Jewish legal decision-making even today. But while the Shulchan Aruch remains definitive, and we routinely return to it for guidance, new issues and new controversies arise in every generation, matters which Joseph Caro knew nothing about in the 16th century. A whole new realm of innovations in Judaism began to spring up in Germany in the 19th century. These innovations brought with them challenges to the established lines of authority. Following the secular Enlightenment in Europe, there developed a Jewish Enlightenment known as the Haskalah. And men like the rabbi and philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, who really developed the Haskalah, began to encourage their fellow Jews to become educated in the German language and culture and move out of the ghettos so that they could enter the university. While these steps in themselves were not matters of halakha, the challenge to religious fundamentals that resulted from liberalization led to the development of new and dramatically divergent patterns of observance in Jewish life. One of the important ideas that motivated the reformers was the notion based on modern scholarship that the Bible was not divinely authored. The reformers declared that only those biblical laws which concerned ethics were binding, while the rest of the halakha no longer needed to be considered normative. In practical matters, the reformers began to make small changes, like preaching sermons in German rather than in Yiddish. They also introduced some slight changes in the language of some of the prayers in the prayer book. The traditionalists, or neo-Orthodox Jews, as they were called, reacted strenuously to these slight changes and rejected all of the new attempts to modernize and contemporize in the synagogue, because they feared that the small changes would create inroads for other, more significant changes. The leader of the neo-Orthodox movement was Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, one of the intellectual leaders of the opposition to reform. Now, although Hirsch was a friend of Abraham Geiger, one of the leading reformers, he criticized the reform movement, saying, "It is foolish to believe that it is the wording of a prayer, the notes of a synagogue tune, or the order of a special service which form the abyss between Reform and Orthodox. It is not the so-called divine service which separates us. Rather, it is the theory, the principle of faithfulness to Jewish law. If the Torah is to you the law of God, how dare you place another law above it and go along with God and his law only as long as you thereby progress in other respects at the same time?" Hirsch's challenge had a boomerang effect. If slight changes were so dangerous and so terribly unacceptable, the reformers felt they had nothing to lose in becoming even bolder in their innovations. And they went on to introduce more radical reforms, including the abandonment of circumcision for male children, the truncating of traditional prayers, and the recitation of them in the vernacular. Also, they introduced the use of musical instruments, especially the organ, during Sabbath and holiday worship. They abandoned the observance of Jewish dietary laws, or kashrut, and they adopted vestments by the rabbis which resembled those of Protestant ministers. And these were only some of the practices which characterized the Reform movement in Germany. The practices of the Reform movement in America today vary widely, but in many ways they are not as extreme as those practiced by some of the reformers in the early years in Germany and in America. Not everyone who was influenced by the Enlightenment was as radical as those of the reformers. There was another approach which also pursued a scholarly understanding and appreciation of Jewish tradition, but which remained committed to essential elements of the tradition. This approach came to be known as the positive historical school. The scholars who developed this school, led by Rabbi Zachariah Frankel of Dresden in the 1840s and 1850s, were committed to retaining Hebrew as the language of prayer. And they remained committed to observing halakha, even as they studied its development and tried to understand why and how it developed the way it developed. In 1854, Frankel became the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau, then in Germany, now in Wrocław, Poland. That's the new name of the city. At the seminary, Frankel taught that Jewish law was not static, but rather it has always developed in response to changing conditions. In calling his approach toward Judaism positive historical, he meant that one should have a positive attitude toward accepting Jewish law and tradition as normative. Yet one should be open to developing the law in the same fashion that it has always developed historically. Frankel rejected the innovations of reform as insufficiently based in Jewish history and communal practice. However, Frankel used modern methods of historical scholarship in analyzing Jewish texts and developing Jewish law in the approach known as the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific or scholarly study of Judaism. This positive historical school positioned itself between the more unbending orthodoxy of Hirsch and the more liberal reform of Geiger. The middle stream of Jewish thinking and practice gave rise to the movement with which I'm associated, the conservative movement in Judaism in America. Professor Solomon Schechter was invited to become the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in 1902. He came from Cambridge, England, where he had distinguished himself as a scholar. He brought with him Zechariah Frankel's ideas, affirming the positive elements in traditional Judaism while grasping the dynamic aspects of the evolving tradition itself. Schechter coined a phrase which may ring in your ears as funny, coined the phrase Catholic Israel, meaning the worldwide or universal Jewish people. The late Rabbi Louis Jacobs of London notes that Schechter stressed that the ultimate source of authority in Judaism is the Jewish people as a whole, in which a consensus emerges as to which aspects of the tradition are permanently binding and which are time-conditioned. This concept of Catholic Israel accords well with the Talmudic instruction to rabbis: do not impose rulings upon the community except if the majority of the people can live by the ruling. You could say that Schechter's expression, Catholic Israel, is a modern articulation of "my children have vanquished me." In greater or lesser degrees, all the movements, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, as well as the more recently developed Reconstructionist movement, reflect a desire to connect to the rich heritage of more than 2,000 years of Jewish tradition. Each movement reflects a sincere attempt to bring the finest of our tradition's values and virtues to bear in adding depth and meaning to our lives as modern Jews. Each movement creates its own balance between the elements of tradition and an impetus for change. Let me share with you an example of how the conservative movement renders decisions. Matters of Jewish law are deliberated in our Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. The 25 colleagues who sit on the committee are men and women who have expertise in halakha. Members of the committee review questions addressed to them by rabbis in the field, as well as emerging issues which need to be considered by the movement as a whole. Unanimity is not often achievable in this committee. Because there is a wide range of opinions and practice in our movement, latitude within the committee's decision needs to be available to my colleagues and me. One important operating rule of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is that any minority decision which receives at least 6 votes in the committee of 25 members may be considered a legitimate option for practice by conservative rabbis. Because of an age-old principle which recognizes that the rabbi of a local congregation is the authority for his or her community, the local rabbi may then adopt either the majority or the minority position as normative for his or her congregation. In Aramaic, the local rabbi is known as the Mara Da'atra, the master of the place, and is given significant authority. A few years ago, when the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards voted on whether to endorse a proposal relating to the involvement of gay and lesbian members in our congregations and whether they can be accepted as candidates for ordination in our movement's seminaries, one member of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards voted twice. This resulted in a 13-13 vote tie, in favor and in opposed. Our congregation's religious and lay leadership follows the liberal position, as did the Jewish Theological Seminary's leadership at the time. An earlier complex issue involved the role of women in Jewish ritual life. The tradition that was observed in all Jewish communities, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, maintained that women were segregated from men in the synagogue. They sat on the other side of a mechitza, a barrier of some sorts, or in a gallery above or behind the men. They did not have the privilege of leading prayers or reading publicly from the Torah. The mere sound of a woman's voice was considered to be arousing for men, so they were prohibited from singing within earshot of men, even in their own homes when male guests were present. As women came to be fully included in the political life of the United States, having gained the vote as a result of the women's suffrage movement with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, Jewish women also became more publicly involved in the synagogue. Early in the life of the conservative movement, separate seating was abandoned. Women began to study and become more Jewishly literate. Many became proficient in synagogue skills, and it became routine for Jewish girls to study in religious after-school or day-school programs at synagogues and schools alongside the boys, which had not previously been the custom. Once these girls were well-versed, just like the boys, they began to expect to participate in the synagogue in the same way as the boys. As the women's movement grew and gained strength and durability in the 60s and the subsequent decades, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards had to examine the traditional literature and determine how to accommodate Jewish women in the synagogue. One privilege which had to be considered was whether women could read from the Torah in public worship. It turns out that the 16th century Shulchan Aruch, that venerable code of law compiled by Rabbi Joseph Karo, which I mentioned earlier, declares that women may be included among the 7 people who read from the Torah on Sabbath. But, he goes on to say, we don't permit it because of kvod hatzibur, which literally means the honor of the congregation. Now that concept, the honor of the congregation, is not defined anywhere. But it sounds like it's a matter which is determined by social norms and familiarities. In the 16th century, it was not customary or normative for women in either the Sephardi or Ashkenazi worlds to become educated or hold public positions. The limit on women's participation was in keeping with general attitudes in those earlier days. But in late 20th century America, that was not an obvious conclusion. By considering the implications of the phrase kvod hatzibur, the honor of the congregation, members of the Law Committee decided that welcoming women to read from the Torah would not dishonor the congregation in any way. It would, in fact, enhance the honor of the congregation to include women in the public reading of the Torah and in all other matters of leadership as well. And this is our practice at Temple Emanu-El for the past 30 years. All the movements have had to give serious consideration to women's role in synagogue life. Since the Reform and Reconstructionist movements feel less bound by halakha, they were quicker than the conservative movement to embrace women's participation. And now, almost 4 decades after our movement welcomed women's public leadership in various aspects of worship, the Orthodox world is challenged to deal with this subject as well. In general, they have been far more reluctant to abandon the age-old patterns. But a woman was recently ordained as a rabbah, feminine for rabbi, privately by an Orthodox rabbi. And this woman, this rabbah, is serving in a congregation that wanted her to serve them and wanted her leadership. You have to understand this is, of course, over the strenuous objections and disapproval of most other Orthodox rabbis. But there is fermentation there, and there is movement, and they can't avoid the issue. My point is this. All of us, no matter where we are on the spectrum of Jewish ideology or practice, have to address new issues as they arise. How we resolve them will differ. There's not likely to be uniformity in the Jewish arena, and not even within each movement. But that's the tradition, going back to the Mishnah, where multiple opinions abounded on just about every subject. As long as we acknowledge that the tradition is in the hands of its loving devotees, both rabbinic and lay, then we, in fact, are the authorities and the shapers of what the tradition becomes, as it continues to evolve from one generation to the next. Recognizing that we are links in that long chain of tradition ultimately connects us back to Sinai. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Franklin, for your very enlightening talk. We have some time for questions, and we have 2 microphones set up, so we invite any of you who might have some questions to come up and ask.
Joan, please.
Thank you. That was just amazing that you could get it all in, 45 minutes like that.
Oh, well, people write books on
Excellent.
this subject,
Yes,
so this is only a précis.
So well articulated.
Thank you.
My question is, and I'm glad you said something about the gender question, and that is, in today's world, between Reform and conservative, I have Reform colleagues who maintain that the egalitarian platform is stronger and sort of trumps the conservative egalitarian platform, and I personally haven't understood that or seen that. Could you say something
I'm
about
not sure I understand
the?
what the differences are or what they mean by that.
Yeah, that's what I don't understand either.
Yeah.
But that some colleagues who will choose Reform Judaism over conservative Judaism have said that it is a choice based on gender and egalitarian platform. And I'm wondering, because I see in the conservative movement women rabbis, women leading Torah service, is there today any kind of difference that you see on that gender issue between those two movements?
I frankly am not sure what they're referring to. I really don't know. The issue that we do differ on still is the issue of halakha. And within the conservative movement, there are definitions of women's roles and so forth that emerge from the halakha. It's not simply that whatever you want to do is fine, just go do it. There are issues in terms of women who choose to accept upon themselves the obligations for public prayer, or to put on tefillin, the phylacteries and things like this. And the expectation that if they make that choice, which they may make, then there's an expectation that they, like men, will continue to do it on a regular basis. Now, because Reform doesn't have any expectation that they would put on tefillin to begin with, there's no expectation. So the breakdown really is in the area of halakha, which we remain committed to, and Reform has said from the beginning that they're really not committed to, even though, as I said earlier, Reform today looks more traditional than Reform in Germany and even in America century and a half ago, when it was much, much more dramatically radical. So while the similarities look closer, there is the underlying issue of commitment to halakha. That's probably where the issue is.
Rabbi,
yes, please.
I think you not only told us about it, but you demonstrated the Talmud in bringing up all the other rabbis and saying Rabbi said this and Rabbi said that.
Any page, you can't read 2 lines without controversy.
Yeah. My real question is, do you see any relationship between the way the Jesuits are able to interpret law and the Talmudic scholars?
I am not a scholar of Jesuit. I'm not a scholar of Jesuit tradition.
From that.
I'm not a scholar of Jesuit tradition. I have heard that Jesuits get into the nitty-gritty, but I have not studied Jesuit teaching, so I really am not competent to comment on it. I couldn't do that. Sorry. Yes, please.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And he brought up Jesuits, be it Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, any of the orders, or even the dioceses. We as Christians, as Catholics, we read the Bible, the interpretation is ours. So it's really, you're never wrong with your interpretation. Earlier you were talking about the Hebrew scriptures or the five books, the Torah.
Right.
You said never to be changed, it's God's word.
Right.
Coming down. We alter our words slightly, but change is constant with us. Is it just the five books that you will never change, that will never be changed with the Jews, or is it all of Hebrew scripture that you're fixed to?
Let me explain. Let me clarify what I said. The entire rabbinic tradition changes the Bible. That is, in effect, what it does. Okay? Let me give you an example. I'm teaching a Talmud course in our high school program right now. We're talking about capital punishment. Reading the Talmud tractate called Sanhedrin. And we're reading the chapter that talks about examination of witnesses. Now, the Torah very clearly stipulates in a few places that for such and such an infraction, the penalty is death. Death penalty, all right? In the Talmud, however, the rabbis create, based on assimilating various verses together with certain words that are present in the various verses, they say that that gives them authority to link the verses, to create a series of 7 questions then to ask the witnesses who are interrogated without being in the presence of the other witnesses. And the answers have to line up completely identically. And if they don't, then there's no case, because you need 2 witnesses who say the same thing to the judges to validate a charge against a defendant. The rabbis go on further and further and further in their discussions to construe as many possible impediments as they can find to make it impossible to convict somebody and put that person to death. Now, they don't take a red pen and rewrite the Torah, okay? But through the process of midrash, they basically make it impossible to fulfill what the Torah said. And that's not the only place they do it. I mean, they do it all over, okay? Christianity does the same thing. The New Testament is, in fact, a Christological midrash on the Hebrew Bible, except it has a point of view that it wants to teach, and it makes that point by using the very same process that the rabbis use in midrash on the Torah and the rest of the Bible to teach about Jesus, drawing it to validate it from the Hebrew Bible. It's the same process. You look at it in that light, you'll see what I'm talking about. All right? So, in fact, the text remains. The application of the text doesn't remain. I'll show you another example. There is a verse in the book of Exodus which gives what we call the 13 attributes of God's mercy. God is loving, forgiving, forbearing, abounding in mercy, patient, on and on and on, right? And then you get to the end, it says, V'nakeh lo yenakeh. As to clearing away the slate, he doesn't clear away the slate. He visits the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who misbehave. Okay? What do the rabbis do? The rabbis don't change the verse. They don't strike out from the Bible. But when they quote it liturgically, they leave off 2 words so that it comes to God is loving and forbearing and patient and kind and merciful, etc., 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 and he clears away the slate. Because instead of v'nakeh, lo yenakeh, as to clearing away, he doesn't clear away, they just leave it as, and he clears away, period. That turns the sentence on its head without rewriting it, but in the ideological interpretation that they hand down to us as worshiping Jews, we come out with a completely different picture of who God is. That's how they do it. That's one way that they do it. Does that help you understand? The whole tradition continues to unfold The Torah is the source. The application is through the process of midrash, which refines, redefines, reinterprets, and in fact, without admitting it, often changes it and turns it on its head.
One other question. Maybe it's good you're here for me to ask this question.
Please.
Christian Catholicism and Judaism. It appears to me that we slight demons. We let them serve in the service. We allow them to do certain works within, certain of God's works, within the realm of what we allow.
Yeah.
Why is it? And change is constant. So
Yes.
maybe 100 years from now, this will be a moot point. But right today, why is it, from your perspective, Jews and Catholics limit women's female role?
Well, as I said, not all Jews do. The more liberal movements, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, all have women fully involved in participating in Jewish life. Now, there are some very right-wing conservative synagogues which don't. I should modify. I mean, there's not uniformity in our movement. As I said before, we have a law committee. You have majority and minority opinions. Some people choose the minority. Sometimes the minority position is more liberal. Sometimes the minority position is more conservative. And rabbis and congregations can choose whichever way they want, and do. The Orthodox movement is struggling with it. Mostly the Orthodox are not inclined to change yet on women's participation, and yet there are those who are being very bold. My daughter went to an Orthodox Jewish day school in Boston for high school. When she started, there was an issue that we had because girls weren't allowed to lead any parts of the service, couldn't read from the Torah and things like this. And we said to the dean of the school, we talked with him at length and said, you know, she's used to doing this in our synagogue, and she likes to do this. Is there any chance that while she's here, this might happen? He said, I know that this is happening in some places. Because I pointed out in some Orthodox synagogues that I've been to, where women, in fact, do read from the Torah and lead parts of the service within certain parameters. He said, I don't think it's going to happen while she's here. And he was right, it didn't. She graduated last year. It didn't happen. All right? Will it someday? It probably will, because in that community in Boston, there is ferment. But the Orthodox movement, as I see the Catholic Church, moves slower. The Catholic Church moves slower than the Episcopal Church and the other liberal Protestant churches. Okay? You're all dealing with the same New Testament and Old Testament, but different voices of interpretation have sway. All right? I can't change the Catholic Church for you.
But you as an individual,
Yeah.
do you see an issue with viewing Catholicism having female priests?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay.
Do I think?
Only allow male.
Yes, I know.
But do you, as maybe not as an individual, but as a Jew, as a Jewish leader within your church, do you find it wrong that Catholicism hasn't progressed to the point of having female?
You know,
as
it's not my place to say what's right or wrong in the Catholic Church. Could I see that it makes sense? Yes, I could see that it would make sense. Do I know that there are Catholics who would like it? Yes, I know that there are Catholics who would like it. Might it help in many ways to add vitality to the Catholic Church? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I see what's happened in our synagogues. I can tell you. But I also know that the way your church is organized, it's not so simple. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure.
Those communities of faith which derive from the faith of Abraham, sometimes their understanding of law that governs their communities comes into conflict with civil law.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, in your community or in Jewish communities today, do you know of any important cases where Jewish understanding of law comes into conflict with civil law?
Let me say that there is an old principle in rabbinic legislation which phrases an answer to your question and I won't leave it there, but it does answer it in a certain way. It says, Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is the law. If we live in a community that has laws that say X, Y, or Z, then we expect to have to conform to those laws, okay? And they differ from place to place where we live and have lived. And there is respect for government. It really goes back to early rabbinic understanding of the story of Noah, and that one of the commandments to the children of Noah, namely to the rest of the world, to the whole world, is that they set up courts of law and establish systems of governance. And we respect that. Are there places where we come in conflict with it? There might be. One, for example, we might have a situation where a medical director in a community wants to do an autopsy on somebody's body after a death because of mysterious, uncertain kind of death. And the rule is that the medical director wants to do or insists on doing an autopsy. Our general preference is not to do autopsies. We like to leave the body in its pristine state as it was when it died. Leave the dignity of the person alone. We don't embalm. We don't tamper with the body. We don't paint, with lipstick and rouge and stuff like this. Person is not on display after death. Person is ritually washed and dressed in simple shrouds, put in a coffin, cover is closed, period. Sometimes we have conflict because the medical director wants one thing, and as a rabbi, sometimes I and the family want to see a sooner funeral and no disgrace to the body. We have to work it out. The rabbis do offer options for when it's necessary, okay? Sometimes it's necessary, particularly if it can inform about a health situation that might affect somebody else in the family. Perhaps somebody else, if there's an unusual kind of case that the doctors in the hospital feel that they could learn from to help other people as they're studying an emerging new disease or getting a new handle on something, then we work with them to do what's necessary. Because saving a life is ultimately the highest virtue. And if we can help do that, even through an autopsy, which we would otherwise not like to do, then we can find ways of doing it. Not routinely, but in defined circumstances, we could do that. So it is possible at times to find that kind of negotiated resolution. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Yes, I was raised in the conservative tradition, and a minyan was 10 men.
Correct.
I assume that has changed as well.
Absolutely.
When
If we
have
didn't count
service-
women in our synagogue, we wouldn't have minyan most times. No, I'm serious.
But in the Orthodox, my wife's family has some very Orthodox.
Uh-huh.
We've been to Reform and we've been to Conservative. We're
Yeah.
members now of Conservative.
Uh-huh.
But now a minyan for most Conservative and Reform would consist of men and women who have been bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. And it's like, when this started happening, you asked about Catholic Church and changes and things like this. When this started happening in our synagogue, some of my friends from Temple Emanu-El will certainly remember, there were people who really were very uncomfortable and were really pushing back and didn't want to see it happen. And we had to introduce it slowly in one arena and then the next arena. And finally we had to push after, it probably took 10 years to really get it into all the arenas and get people used to it. And now some of the people who were the most belligerent and the most obstinate about it, they don't bat an eyelash. They don't think about it. They probably don't even remember that they objected. Because women get up in our daily service every day, morning and afternoon, and lead the prayers and read the Torah. And men get up and lead the prayers and read the Torah. And it's like, what else is new? Okay? We have gotten accustomed to it. When I first started inviting women up to the Torah in my congregation, it felt strange. I was in favor of it. I wanted to see it happen because ideologically I was in touch with this, but it was strange. But you get used to it. If you open yourself to the possibilities and you allow yourself to think through both the theology and the practicality, and really get in touch with real life, you can accommodate and you can move. Barbara?
I just wanted to add one thing to that. As being involved in Temple Emanu-El since I was a child, when we started to think about being more welcoming to intermarried families, it took us a year discussing how we would address the male to the family. A whole year we discussed it. Right? Yeah.
Right.
Right.
MAIL.
Would it be Mr. So-and-so and, or just Mr. So-and-so, or Mrs. So-and-so? There were so many people who couldn't wrap their head around having non-Jewish people on the mailing list, on the temple mailing list. So change comes, but very slowly, very slowly.
Judith?
I have a comment, but also a political question. The comment is that at Central Congregational Church, until about 35 years ago, women were not allowed to usher. So even in very
Even liberal
even
Protestantism.
in very liberal Protestant congregations, life can be somewhat.
So the Catholic Church isn't as far behind as they think, right?
That's right. On a political issue, when you speak of the possible changes within Orthodoxy,
Yeah.
the news, at least, constantly comes out with information about the growing Orthodox community in Israel, which is ever more obstinate and uncooperative vis-a-vis the more secular or the more liberal religious congregations.
Right.
How is that going to happen? What's going to be the next step? You don't know.
They are positioning themselves, you're right. The ultra-Orthodox in Israel and in America are positioning themselves further and further and further to the extreme right. And they may just stay there for a long time. I don't know. Will they hold sway? They're trying desperately to exert tremendous power over the government and over how life happens there. Israeli friends of mine, and from my own reading in the Israeli newspapers as well, I'm aware that there is serious reaction, serious, deep, penetrating resentment to this. And I mean, one of my Israeli friends keeps telling me, he says, there's going to be an explosion. The place is going to blow up. Not because of the Arabs. It's going to blow up internally because the secular and more liberally observant Jews won't stand for it and won't tolerate the kinds of restrictions that they have imposed and are trying to impose. And there's already been pushback. But yes, I mean, it's a serious problem. But these people, for whatever reason, we have people in America too, who turn their back on modernity, who can't deal with the complexity of modern life and need a more simpler kind of existence. And you have certain fundamentalists in all communities, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. I don't know about the Hindus and others, but certainly in these three Abrahamic religions, you have very liberal folks, you have moderate people who do like we do, kind of balancing act, and you have people who turn their back on all of it and retreat into their little segregated communities. I mean, ultra-Orthodox here in America, there are people in Providence who don't have televisions, who won't listen to the internet. I mean, it's like off limits. You can't be exposed to the modern world. It's like Samson Raphael Hirsch in Germany in the 19th century was afraid of the slightest change because of the implications that change is possible. Okay? If you have the slightest incursion from the news, from a picture, I mean, in Israel they go crazy if there's a woman in a bathing suit on a signboard. Okay? They destroy bus stops because it has a picture of a woman in a bathing suit. All right? That's crazy. But they refuse to tolerate those kind of incursions because it might destroy the whole world. There are those people. So, and communities wrestle and move, and sometimes it's straight line, and usually it's not a straight line. It's like the stock market. Yes?
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for coming.
Sure, pleasure.
I have a question for you concerning, does the conservative movement recognize children of interracial marriages as Jewish?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have some in our congregation, as a matter of fact. Children are automatically Jewish if their mother is Jewish. If the mother is not Jewish, the father is Jewish, and the couple wants to raise them as Jews, then those children at very young age can be taken to a mikveh, a ritual bath, ritual pool, for formal conversion, and then the family makes a commitment to raise them as Jews. And the interracial nature has nothing to do with it. I mean, it's not even a question. Okay? We have interracial couples in the congregation. We have couples who have adopted children from Africa, take them to the mikveh. They're Jewish. It's like, what else is new? It's not an issue. It's really not an issue. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Franklin. Please. And again, thank you to all of you who have come out on this torrentially rainy evening for our presentation. We hope to see you again in the spring. And just a quick announcement: those of you who are invited to the reception can just pass through these doors to the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies, which is just down the stairs here. So please join us.